He had spent the last of his savings on a pump he wasn't sure would work, and as the brown water finally began to recede from the marsh his father had warned him never to touch, Caleb Hartwell saw the corner of something dark rising out of the mud. He thought it was a stone at first, then a stump. Then, when the water dropped another foot, and the shape kept going down into the earth, far deeper than any stone or stump had a right to, he felt his stomach turn cold. Because whatever was buried out there in the soft black ground of his dying farm had edges. Straight ones. The kind no river ever made. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. For 3 generations the Hartwells had farmed the low country at the eastern edge of Crane County, Ohio, a flat green sprawl of corn and soybean broken only by the dark scar of land they all called the back marsh. 40 acres of it, give or take, sitting at the bottom of the property where the rainwater pooled and never quite left. Caleb's grandfather had drawn a line around it on the old plat map in 1951 and written 2 words in pencil that had never been erased. Leave it. His father had repeated those words like scripture. You don't drain the marsh, Caleb. You don't dig it. You don't plant it. Some ground is meant to stay the way it is. And for most of his 31 years, Caleb had obeyed. Because there had been no reason not to, and because his father had said it in the kind of voice that didn't invite questions. Now there was every reason in the world. Caleb stood at the edge of the marsh on a gray morning in early April, the rented diesel pump chugging beside him, and tried to remember the last time anything on this farm had gone right. His wife, Sarah, had left 11 months ago, not in anger but in exhaustion, the slow kind that builds up over years of watching a man pour everything he has into dirt that gives nothing back. She'd taken their daughter, Emma, who was 6 now and forgetting the smell of the place, and moved in with her sister 2 counties over. Caleb didn't blame her. He blamed the price of corn, which had collapsed 2 seasons running. He blamed the bank, which had sent him a letter in a thin white envelope that he'd read at the kitchen table at midnight, and then read again because the numbers didn't seem real. 91 days. That was how long he had before the foreclosure proceedings began on the only home he'd ever known. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders from a lifetime of physical work, with a sun-browned face that looked older than 31 and hands that had been cracked and rebuilt so many times they no longer registered cold. His hair was the color of wet straw, going gray early at the temples. He wore the same canvas coat his father had worn, patched twice at the elbows, and boots that he'd resold himself because new ones were a luxury he could no longer justify. People in town who'd known him since he was a boy said he had his father's quiet and his mother's stubbornness, and that was about right. Henry Hartwell had died of a heart attack 4 years back, dropped right in the equipment shed with a wrench still in his hand, and Caleb's mother had followed him within the year, the way long-married people sometimes do, as if they'd made an agreement no one else was privy to. So it was just Caleb now. Caleb and the farm and the marsh and the 91 days. He talked to Emma on Sunday nights, when Sarah let him call. Their conversations were short, the way conversations with 6-year-olds are, full of long pauses and sudden changes of subject. Emma would tell him about school, about a girl named Priya who was her best friend, about a tooth that was loose and how she was going to put it under her pillow. And Caleb would sit at the kitchen table holding the phone too tight and try to keep his voice light, try to be the father she'd want to come home to, and not the broken man at the end of his rope who couldn't even keep her bedroom from gathering dust. "When are you coming to visit?" Emma would ask sometimes, not understanding that it was she who would have to visit him, that the distance ran the way it did because her mother had been right to put it there. "Soon, baby," he'd say. "Soon." And he'd hang up and sit in the dark a while, and the silence of the house would press down on him like water. Sarah hadn't yelled when she left. That was the thing he kept coming back to. He could have borne yelling. What he couldn't bear was the gentleness of it, the way she'd packed Emma's things in the daylight while he was out in the field, the note on the table that said only that she loved him, and that love wasn't the problem, that she couldn't watch him drown anymore, and she wouldn't let Emma watch it either. She'd asked him once, near the end, what he was holding on to. "The farm doesn't love you back, Caleb," she'd said. It just takes. And he hadn't had an answer for her, because the answer was something he couldn't put into words. Something about his father dropping dead in the shed with a wrench in his hand, and his grandfather's name on the deed, and the simple animal fact that he didn't know who he'd be if he wasn't a Hartwell on Hartwell land. She'd left because he loved a thing that couldn't love him back. And the worst of it was she wasn't wrong. The idea had come to him in February, late at night, the way desperate ideas always come. He'd been sitting with the county agricultural maps spread across the table, trying to find some acreage he wasn't using, some way to squeeze one more crop out of the land before the bank took it. And his eye had fallen on the back marsh. 40 acres. 40 acres he'd been told his whole life to leave alone, sitting there doing nothing, growing cattails and mosquitoes while he scraped at the rest of the property like a man trying to wring water from a stone. If he could drain it, even partly, even for one season, he could plant it. The soil down there would be rich, black bottom land, the kind that grew corn taller than a man. One good harvest off 40 new acres might be enough. Not to fix everything, but maybe enough to buy time. Maybe enough to show the bank he was worth the risk. His father's voice had come to him then, clear as the diesel engine in front of him now. You don't drain the marsh, Caleb. But his father was dead, and his father's rules hadn't saved the farm, and a dead man's superstition wasn't going to put food on the table or keep a roof over Emma's head when she came to visit. So Caleb had made his decision the way he made all of them, slowly, alone, and without telling anyone until it was done. He'd driven to the bank in town and taken out the last small line of credit he had any hope of getting, $800, against equipment he'd already half paid off. He'd used $600 of it to rent the pump and lay the drainage pipe, the long corrugated lengths of it now snaking down toward the creek at the property's edge where the marsh water would go. The remaining $200 he kept folded in his wallet, his entire liquid worth, the difference between him and a man with nothing at all. When he told Dale Brunner about it, Dale had laughed. Dale farmed the property to the north and had been Caleb's father's friend, a leathery man in his 60s with a belly that hung over his belt and an opinion about everything. Caleb had run into him at the feed store, and in a moment of weakness, or maybe just loneliness, he'd mentioned the plan. Dale had set down the bag of supplement he was carrying and looked at Caleb like he'd announced he was going to plant money trees. You're going to drain Henry's marsh, Dale had said. Boy, your daddy would roll over. That ground's no good. You know how many men tried to farm bottomland like that and lost their shirts? Water comes back, Caleb. It always comes back. You'll spend everything you got, and in 2 years it'll be a marsh again, and you'll have nothing to show for it but a busted pump and a debt. Caleb had nodded and said maybe, and paid for his feed, and left. But the words had stuck in him like a splinter. You'll have nothing. As if he had so much now. As if there was some great fortune Dale thought he was risking, when the truth was Caleb had already lost almost everything a man could lose. His wife. His daughter, mostly. His father and mother. His pride, which had gone the day he'd had to sell the second tractor. The farm was the last thing, and the bank already had its hand on that. Draining the marsh wasn't a risk. It was a Hail Mary. And a man only throws a Hail Mary when the game is already lost. The thing about a small town was that words traveled. By the end of that week, 3 different people had found a reason to mention the marsh dam. Old Pete Cernick, who ran the grain elevator, asked him at the counter whether it was true he was draining the bottom ground. And when Caleb said it was, Pete had shaken his head slowly and said his own father had always called that piece the devil's bathtub and steered the cattle clear of it. The woman at the diner where Caleb sometimes allowed himself a cup of coffee and an hour out of the empty house had refilled his cup and said, not unkindly, that her husband heard he'd gone and rented a pump and was everything all right out at the farm. Even the boy who pumped the diesel had heard. The whole county seemed to know that Caleb Hartwell was doing the one thing every Hartwell before him had refused to do, and the whole county seemed to agree, in the gentle, merciless way of small places, that he'd lost his mind, or his nerve, or both, and that it would end the way all such things ended, in failure and shame and a foreclosure sign at the foot of the lane. He stopped going to town more than he had to. It was easier to be alone with the work than to be alone in a crowd of people who pitted him. The pump had run for 9 days. Caleb had set it going on the last day of March, and for 9 days and 9 nights it had thrummed and groaned, and pulled the standing water out of the marsh, and pushed it down the corrugated pipe toward the creek. He'd checked it every few hours, sleeping in snatches, walking the quarter-mile from the house to the marsh in the dark with a flashlight to make sure the diesel hadn't run dry or the intake hadn't clogged with weed. The water had gone down slowly at first, then faster as the channels he'd cut began to do their work. The cattails had drooped and laid over. The smell of the place had changed, from the green rot of standing water to something older and darker, the smell of mud that hadn't seen the sky in a very long time. The marsh fought him the whole way. That was how he came to think of it, in those long cold nights walking down with the flashlight. It fought him the way the whole farm had always fought him, the way the corn prices fought him and the bank fought him and his own grief fought him. The intake clogged on the third night and he had to wade in to clear it, the cold water filling his boots. And on the fifth night the diesel line cracked, and he lost 3 hours and a quart of fuel he could ill afford before he got it patched. Twice he thought the pump had thrown a seal and his $800 had bought him nothing but a ruined machine and a deeper hole. Both times it caught and ran on. There were moments, standing out there at 3 in the morning with the engine hammering and the dark pressing in and the water going down by inches, when he thought about Sarah's note. The farm doesn't love you back. It just takes. And he wondered whether he was draining the marsh or whether the marsh was draining him, pulling the last of his money and his strength and his hope down into the mud the way it pulled the water. But on the 9th morning, the shape had appeared. Caleb stood looking at it now, his breath fogging in the chill, the pump still running behind him out of habit more than need, because most of the open water was gone. What remained was a vast flat expanse of black mud, glistening, soft, pocked with the holes of fleeing things, stretching out to the tree line at the marsh's far edge. And in the middle of it, perhaps 200 feet out, rose the dark shape that had stopped his heart. It was hard to make out from where he stood. The mud clung to it, half swallowed it. But he could see enough. It was angular. It had corners. The part above the mud was maybe 4 feet across and rose perhaps 2 feet out of the muck. But the way the ground sloped around it suggested it went much deeper, that what he was seeing was only the top of something large. The surface, where the mud had slid away, was dark, but not the brown-black of wood or the gray of stone. It was darker than that. It had a dull sheen where the weak sunlight caught it. Metal. Caleb's first thought was that it was farm equipment. An old harrow, maybe, or a plow that had been abandoned out here decades ago and sunk into the soft ground. That would have made sense. That would have been ordinary. But the more he looked, the less it looked like any equipment he knew. There were no wheels he could see, no tines, no familiar shape. Just that angular dark mass, sitting where his grandfather had drawn a line and written "Leave it." He thought about going out to it right then. But the mud was treacherous, he knew that much. A man could sink to his waist in marsh bottom and not get out without help, and there was no one to help him. So he stood at the edge a while longer, looking, and then he went and shut off the pump, because the silence felt suddenly necessary, and the diesel rattled to a stop and the marsh went quiet around him. In the quiet, he could hear the water still trickling down the drainage pipe, and the small sucking sounds of the mud settling, and his own heart, which had not slowed down. Leave it, his father had said. Some ground is meant to stay the way it is. Caleb went back to the house and got a length of rope, a long plank from the equipment shed, and the highest pair of waders he owned. He told himself he was just going to look, just going to get close enough to see what it was, and then he'd decide. He laid the plank out across the worst of the mud and walked it like a bridge, the wood sinking and bowing under his weight, the mud sucking at it greedily. When the plank ran out, he laid the rope ahead of him and pulled himself along, half crawling, the cold black muck soaking through his waders and into his clothes, the smell of it filling his nose and mouth. It took him the better part of an hour to cross 200 feet. Twice the mud nearly took him. The first time his right boot went down and kept going, the cold black muck climbing his calf, his thigh, faster than seemed possible, and he'd had to throw himself flat across the plank and haul the leg out inch by sucking inch while the marsh pulled at him like a living thing that did not want to let go. The second time was worse. He'd put weight on a patch that looked solid, and it had simply opened beneath him, both legs going down to the hip. And for one white moment of pure animal terror, he'd felt himself sinking with nothing to grab. The rope just out of reach, the surface of the mud closing cold around his waist. He'd lunged and caught the rope and dragged himself out by main strength, lying afterward on the firmer ground gasping, his heart trying to climb out of his chest. He thought of all the men Dale said had lost their shirts in bottom land like this, and he thought of his grandfather's word for it, bad ground. And for the first time he wondered whether the rule had ever really been about what was buried at all, or whether the marsh itself was simply hungry, and 70 years of warnings had been the family's way of staying clear of a thing that wanted to swallow them. When he finally reached the shape, he was exhausted and filthy and shaking, as much from what he'd find as from the cold. Up close it was bigger than it had looked from the edge. The top of it stood at the height of his chest where he knelt in the mud, and it was wider than he could reach across. He put his hand on it, and felt the cold of the metal through his glove, a deep chill that seemed to come from far below. He pulled off the glove and touched it with his bare hand, and the cold was the same, the cold of something that had been buried in the dark for a very, very long time. He began to dig. He'd brought a small folding spade, and he used it to clear the mud away from the top of the thing, working slowly, his arms aching. As he dug, the shape revealed itself. It was rectangular. The top was flat, or had been, before whatever long burial had warped and pitted it. And as he cleared the mud from one corner, he found something that made him stop, his spade frozen in the air. A seam. A straight vertical line running down the side of the thing, too precise to be anything but made. He followed it with his fingers, scraping the mud away, and found that the line ran down into the mud and disappeared. 8 feet to the right, when he crawled over and dug, there was another. 2 seams. Parallel. The edges of something. A panel, or a door, or a wall. Caleb sat back on his heels in the freezing mud and looked at what he'd found, and the thought came to him slow and certain. This was not equipment. This was not a stone. Someone had made this, and someone had buried it here. In the back marsh, on the Hartwell land, where his grandfather had drawn a line and 3 generations of men had been told never to dig. His grandfather had known. That was the thought that frightened him most, kneeling there in the mud. The line on the map. The pencil words. Leave it. His grandfather had bought this farm in 1949, for years before he drew that line. He'd known something was out here. He'd known, and he'd hidden it under a rule passed down like a family secret. And his son had carried the rule without ever knowing why, and now Caleb had broken it. He stayed out there until the light began to fail, digging, scraping, mapping the edges of the thing with his hands. By the time he crawled back across the mud to solid ground, full dark was coming on, and he could barely feel his fingers. He stripped off the ruined waders at the edge of the marsh and walked back to the house in his soaked clothes, shivering so hard his teeth clicked, and he stood under the hot water of the shower for a long time, until the cold finally let go of his bones. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in the bed he'd once shared with Sarah, in the house he'd grown up in, and he stared at the ceiling and thought about the dark shape in the mud. He thought about his grandfather, a man he barely remembered, who died when Caleb was 4. He thought about the way his father had said leave it, and wondered now if there'd been fear in it, fear his father himself might not have understood, just a thing handed down. Some ground is meant to stay the way it is. Toward dawn he got up and went down to the kitchen and dug through the old roll-top desk where his father had kept the farm papers, looking for anything, the original deed, the surveys, the letters his grandfather might have left. He'd never gone through it all carefully. After his parents died, there'd been too much grief and too much work, and the desk had become a place he simply didn't open. Now he opened every drawer. Most of it was what he expected. Tax records going back decades. Equipment receipts. The deed, with the long legal description of the property. Insurance papers. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a false panel he'd never known was there, found only because his shaking hand knocked the drawer too hard and the bottom shifted, he found a tin box. It was the kind that had once held tobacco, dented and rusted at the seams, and it was heavier than it looked. Caleb set it on the kitchen table under the single hanging bulb and worked the lid loose. Inside were papers, brittle and yellow, folded many times. And on top of them, a photograph. It was black and white, scalloped at the edges the way old photographs were. It showed two men standing in front of what Caleb recognized as the equipment shed, only newer, the wood pale and unweathered. One of the men was his grandfather, young, lean, with the same straw-colored hair Caleb had. The other man Caleb didn't know. He was older, heavy-set, wearing a suit that looked out of place against the farm, and he had his hand on Caleb's grandfather's shoulder in a way that wasn't friendly. It was possessive, the way a man holds something he owns. On the back, in pencil, in his grandfather's careful hand, were words. The day he came. May 1950. God forgive me for what I agreed to. Caleb read the words 3 times. Then he unfolded the first of the papers beneath the photograph, and he began to read. And as he read, the gray light of morning crept across the kitchen floor, and the coffee he'd poured went cold beside him, untouched. The first paper was a letter, or the draft of one, in his grandfather's hand. It was dated June of 1950, a month after the photograph. The writing was cramped and hurried, as if the man writing it had been afraid. I have agreed to a thing I do not understand, it began, and I have taken money I should not have taken, and now I am bound to it for the rest of my life, and so, I fear, are my children after me. The men came in the spring. They were not from the county. They wore good clothes and drove a long black automobile, and they knew my name before I told it to them. They knew about the loan against the North Field, and they knew about Margaret's illness, and they knew, somehow, that I was a man who could be bought. Caleb's hands had gone very still. They asked me for the use of the back marsh. Not to buy it. They were clear about that. They did not want their name on any paper. They wanted only the use of it, for one night, and they wanted my silence after. And for these 2 things they offered me more money than I will earn in 20 years of farming. I asked what they meant to do out there. The heavy one, the one in the photograph, told me I was better off not knowing, and that knowing would be dangerous for me and for my family, and that all I needed to do was take the money, ask no questions, and forget I had ever seen them. I am ashamed to write that I took it. The letter went on. His grandfather described the night. A convoy of trucks coming up the farm lane after dark, no lights. The men working through the small hours with lanterns out in the marsh. The sound of machinery, the cattails trampled flat. His grandfather had been told to stay in the house with the curtains drawn, and he had, sitting up all night at this very kitchen table, while strange men buried something in his marsh. In the morning the trucks were gone, and the marsh looked almost as it had, the water already creeping back over the disturbed ground, and there was an envelope under his door thick with cash. I do not know what they buried. His grandfather had written. I never asked and I never looked. But I have drawn a line around that ground on every map I own, and I have told my son he must never drain it or dig it or plant it, and his son after him, for as long as this family holds this land. I have told them it is bad ground. That is the lie I will pass down to protect them, because the truth is more dangerous than any lie. Whatever sleeps out there in the marsh, it was put there by men who would kill to keep it hidden, and the only safety we have is to leave it be and let the water keep it secret. There was more, in a different ink, added later, the handwriting shakier, the hand of an older man. It is 30 years now since that night, and they have never stopped watching. A car comes sometimes, slow on the road, and a man I do not know looks up the lane at my house, and then drives on. They came to the funeral when Margaret passed, and stood at the back and did not speak to anyone. I think they come to remind me that they remember, and that I had better remember too. I have kept my end. I have taken nothing more from them and given them nothing but my silence, and I will carry what I know into the ground. But I am afraid for Henry, and for whatever children Henry may have, because I have bound them to a thing they did not choose, and the only protection I can give them is ignorance, and a line on a map, and a rule. Leave it. God willing, that will be enough. God willing, the water will hold. Caleb set the letter down. Outside, the sun had cleared the tree line, and through the kitchen window he could see, far down the slope, the dark drained scar of the marsh, and the small black shape rising out of it where he had dug. He thought about the men in the long black car. He thought about a debt thick enough to silence a man for life and a thing dangerous enough that his grandfather would build a lie around it and feed that lie to his children. He thought about the bank and the 91 days, which were now 89. And he thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had two choices. He could do what his grandfather had begged him to do across 70 years. He could shut off the pump for good and let the water come back and the secret sleep. Or he could go back out into the mud and finish digging and find out what was worth burying in the dark and what it might be worth to a man who had run out of every other option in the world. He looked at the photograph again. The day he came. God forgive me for what I agreed to. Caleb folded the papers back into the tin and closed the lid. He sat for a long while in the morning light. Then he stood and pulled on his father's canvas coat and went out to the equipment shed for a longer rope and a better spade, because he had already known, since the moment he'd seen the straight edge rising out of the mud, which choice he was going to make. He was a Hartwell, and the Hartwells, his mother used to say, were too stubborn to know when to leave well enough alone. His grandfather had proven that the day he took the money. His father had proven it every day he held to a rule he didn't understand. And now Caleb would prove it too, out in the cold black mud, with the bank closing in and his grandfather's confession folded in a tin on the kitchen table. The second day in the marsh was worse than the first. A cold rain had come in overnight, and the mud, which had begun to firm at the surface, was wet and treacherous again. Caleb laid a second plank end to end with the first, building a longer bridge, and he drove a steel fence post deep into the firmer ground at the marsh's edge and ran his rope from it, so that he had a lifeline back to solid earth. He'd learned that much from the day before. The marsh wanted to keep what fell into it. He did not intend to be kept. By mid-morning he was back at the shape, kneeling in the muck, digging. The rain ran down his collar and the cold worked into him. But he kept at it, clearing the mud from the upper portion of the thing, trying to understand its size and shape. By noon he had exposed perhaps 5 feet of it, and what he saw confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. It was a container of some kind. A box, but enormous, the size of a small room. The walls were metal, riveted, the rivets standing proud where corrosion had eaten the surface around them. The 2 seams he'd found the day before were, he could see now, the edges of a large door or hatch set into the side facing him, with corroded hinges along one edge, and, in the center, a mechanism caked solid with mud and rust. He scraped at it with the edge of his spade, and the mud came away in clots, and beneath it he found a wheel, a circular handle, the kind he'd seen in pictures of ship hatches and bank vaults. A locking wheel. Caleb sat back. The rain had eased to a drizzle. Out beyond the marsh the corn ground lay wet and empty and gray, and the house stood small on its rise, and the whole world was silent except for the drip of water and his own breathing. He looked at the wheel, brown with rust, set into the side of a buried metal room that men in a long black car had put here 70 years ago and paid his grandfather a fortune to forget. He should be afraid. Some part of him was. But a larger part, the part that had lain awake doing math at midnight, the part that had read the foreclosure letter twice, the part that missed his daughter so badly it was a physical ache, that part of him looked at the rusted wheel and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years. Hope. Terrible, foolish, dangerous hope. He let himself think it, kneeling there in the freezing mud, the thing he hadn't let himself think since the shape first broke the surface. If what was in here was worth so much that men would watch a farm for 70 years to keep it, then it was worth enough to save him, to pay the bank, to keep the land, to put Emma's bedroom back in use, and maybe, in time, to bring her mother to look at him with something other than that gentle, terrible sorrow. He'd spent 2 years feeling the future, close around him like the mud closed around a man's legs, inch by inch, until there was nothing left to do but go under. And here, maybe, was a way out. Not earned, not deserved exactly, just found, the way a drowning man finds a rope. His grandfather had taken money he shouldn't have and called it a sin. Caleb wasn't sure he had the luxury of calling anything a sin anymore. He had 89 days and a daughter and a name to keep, and if the Marsh wanted to give back some of what it had taken from the Hartwells, He was not going to refuse it out of a dead man's fear. But there was the other voice too. His grandfather's. His father's. Leave it. The men who would kill to keep it hidden. Caleb thought of Vance, the smooth pale eyes, the card on the hood of the truck, and he understood that hope and danger were the same object here, the same buried room, and that he could not have the one without the other. To reach for the rope was to wake the men who'd been watching the grave. Whatever was in here, taking it would not be like finding money in the road. It would be a fight. And he was one man, alone, broke, on a dying farm, against people patient and powerful enough to wait 3 generations. He gripped the wheel with both hands and pulled. Nothing. He braced his feet against the mud and pulled until his arms shook and his vision swam. And still nothing. 70 years of corrosion had welded it shut. He'd need penetrating oil, and a pry bar, and probably a torch, and time, and he had a sick feeling he didn't have much of any of those things. But he had until dark, and he had his father's stubbornness, and he had 89 days, and the wheel had moved, just slightly, just a fraction, when he'd thrown his whole weight against it the last time. He was almost sure of it. He worked at it until the light went, oiling the wheel from a can he'd brought, beating at the seized mechanism with a hammer, throwing his weight against it again and again. And in the last gray of the day, with his hands raw inside his ruined gloves and his whole body trembling, the wheel gave. It turned, a quarter rotation, with a grinding shriek of metal that echoed across the empty marsh and sent something splashing away through the mud. Caleb froze, his heart slamming, and looked around at the gathering dark. But there was nothing, just the rain and the mud and the buried thing, finally, after 70 years, beginning to open. He didn't open it that night. He couldn't. His body was at its end, and the dark was complete now, and whatever waited behind that door, he didn't want to meet it by flashlight, alone, exhausted, with the marsh black around him. He turned the wheel back to where it had been, some instinct telling him to leave no sign, and he pulled himself back along the rope to solid ground and walked up to the house on legs that barely held him. That night, washed and fed and lying in the dark, he heard a car on the road. It was nothing, probably. The county road ran past the foot of the property, and cars went by at all hours. But this one slowed. He heard the engine drop, heard the tires crunch on the gravel of the lane's mouth, heard it idle there a long moment in the dark. Caleb got up and went to the window. He could see headlights at the bottom of the lane, 2 pale cones in the misting rain, pointed up toward the house. They sat there. A minute, 2. Then they swung away, and the car pulled back onto the road and was gone, and the night was quiet again. Caleb stood at the window a long time after. He told himself it was nothing. A lost driver. Someone turning around. But his grandfather's words were in his head now. The men who would kill to keep it hidden. And he found he was listening to the dark in a way he hadn't before, and that the hope he'd felt out in the marsh had a cold thread of fear running through it now, fine as a hair, but there. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat in the kitchen with the lights off and the tin box open in front of him, going back over the papers by the glow of his phone, reading his grandfather's confession until he had whole lines of it by heart. A car comes sometimes, slow on the road. 30 years his grandfather had written that. And how many years before and since had the slow cars come, watching a poor man's farm, making sure the water held its secret? Caleb tried to imagine the patience of it, the institutional patience of whoever Vance answered to. Men who would wait 2 generations, 3, watching a marsh, because what was buried under it mattered enough that no span of years could make them forget. He thought of the photograph. The heavy man with his hand on his grandfather's shoulder like an owner. The day he came. Whatever had come that day in 1950, it had never really left. It had just gone under the water to wait. And now Caleb had pulled the water off it. And it was awake again, and so were they. Toward dawn he made a decision that surprised him with its coldness. He took the tin box, and he didn't put it back in the desk. He carried it out to the barn, and he hid it in the wall, behind a loose board in the old tack room where his father used to keep the bridles, a hiding place he'd known since he was a boy. If men like Vance came to the house, and some instinct told him they would, the papers were the one thing he could not let them have. They were proof. Of what? Exactly, he didn't yet know. But a man who'd spent his life watching his family lose everything had learned that proof was the only kind of leverage the powerless ever got, and he was not going to give it away. In the morning, he drove into town. He needed supplies, penetrating oil, and a long pry bar and a better light. And he needed to do it without raising questions, because the last thing he wanted was for word to get around that Caleb Hartwell was digging something up out of the old marsh. Crane County was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, where a man buying unusual things at the hardware store on a weekday might find himself the subject of speculation by supper time. So he went to the big farm supply store out on the highway instead of Brunner's feed store in town, the anonymous one where the clerks were teenagers who didn't know him, and he bought what he needed and paid in cash from the $200 in his wallet, which was now closer to $140. He was loading the truck in the parking lot when a voice said his name. Caleb Hartwell. He turned. A man was standing a few feet away, between Caleb's truck and a clean dark sedan that looked out of place among the mud-spattered pickups. The man was perhaps 50, well-dressed in a way that no one in Crane County dressed on a Tuesday. A charcoal coat over a collared shirt, no tie, good shoes that hadn't been near a field in their life. He was smiling, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, which were pale and steady and fixed on Caleb's face. "That's me," Caleb said. "I thought so." The man's voice was smooth and unhurried. "You have the look of your grandfather. I'm sorry to approach you like this, in a parking lot. My name is Vance. I represent some people with a long-standing interest in your family's land." Caleb felt the cold thread of fear pull tight. He set down the can of oil he'd been holding and made his face still, the way he made it still when the bank called. "What kind of interest?" he said. "The historical kind," Vance said, still smiling. "There was an arrangement, many years ago, between your grandfather and the people I represent. An arrangement concerning a certain part of your property. The low ground. The marsh. I'm sure you know the piece I mean. I'm told it floods." Caleb said nothing. "We've kept an eye on the property over the years," Vance went on, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather, "as a matter of due diligence. And recently we noticed some activity. Equipment. A pump, I believe. We wondered if perhaps you'd run into some financial difficulty, Mr. Hartwell. It happens to a lot of farmers these days. Hard times. And we wondered if perhaps, in your difficulty, you might be considering doing something with that low ground that your grandfather and your father, very wisely, never did." The fear was a cold stone in Caleb's gut now. They'd been watching. The car last night. The slowing on the road. They'd been watching, maybe for 70 years, the way you'd watch a grave to make sure nothing climbed out of it. "I'm draining it to plant it," Caleb said, keeping his voice level. "That's all. Times are hard, like you said. I need the acreage." Vance studied him for a long moment. "Of course," he said finally. "That makes good sense. Bottomland is rich. But I'd offer you a word of advice, Mr. Hartwell, one I hope you'll take in the spirit it's meant. That ground isn't worth what you think it is. There are things buried in old marshes, sometimes, things that are better left buried. Old contamination, industrial waste, from the days before anyone regulated such things. A man who digs in ground like that can find himself in a great deal of trouble. Legal trouble, health trouble, the kind of trouble that costs far more than a single crop is worth." He took a card from his coat and held it out. Caleb didn't take it, so Vance set it on the hood of the truck. "If you find anything out there that troubles you," he said, "you call that number, and we'll make it go away. Quietly. At no cost to you. In fact, the people I represent would be willing to compensate you generously for your cooperation. Generously enough, I think, to solve whatever difficulty has you renting pumps." He let that settle. "They were always fond of your family. Your grandfather was a reasonable man. I hope you'll be reasonable too." Then he got into his sedan and drove away, and Caleb stood in the parking lot with the card on the hood of his truck and his heart going hard, and he understood two things with perfect clarity. The first was that whatever lay in the marsh was real and valuable and dangerous enough that powerful men had spent 70 years watching a dirt-poor farm in Ohio to keep it hidden. The second was that they didn't know he'd already opened it. Vance had been fishing. If they'd known how far Caleb had gotten, the conversation would have gone differently. They thought he was still draining, still at the start. They thought there was still time to buy him off before he saw what was down there, which meant Caleb had a window, a narrow one. Before they came back, before they stopped being polite, before a man like Vance decided that a reasonable offer wasn't working and tried something else. He had a window to get back out into that marsh, turn the wheel the rest of the way, and open the door. He picked up the card and read the number, and then he put it in his pocket, and got in the truck, and drove home faster than the muddy road wanted him to go. He kept checking the mirror the whole way. Twice he was sure a car was following him, and twice it turned off before he reached his own lane. And by the time he pulled up to the house, his hands ached from gripping the wheel. He sat in the truck a moment in the yard, the engine ticking as it cooled, and looked at the farm the way a stranger might. The sagging barn, the equipment shed where his father had died, the house his grandfather built with his own hands, on land his grandfather had ruined by taking money he should never have taken. Caleb had grown up believing the farm was a kind of inheritance, a thing handed down out of love. Now he understood it was something else too. It was a debt. His grandfather had taken a devil's bargain to save it, and the saving had bound them all, and the Marsh had sat at the bottom of the property for 70 years like a stone in the family's gut, and not one of them had ever known why. His father had carried the rule to his grave without understanding it, had died, maybe, never knowing what he was protecting. There was a grief in that Caleb hadn't expected, a grief for his father that opened up fresh and raw. The thought of the man holding so faithfully to a fear he couldn't even name. He understood the fear now, and he was going to defy it anyway. He didn't go to the house. He drove straight to the marsh. It was early afternoon, the rain finally gone, a hard blue sky overhead, and a cold wind moving across the drained mud flats. Caleb pulled on the waders, grabbed the oil and the pry bar and the new work light, and went out across the planks and along the rope to the buried container, working fast now, the conversation in the parking lot driving him. He soaked the wheel mechanism in penetrating oil and waited as long as he could stand to wait, which wasn't long, and then he fit the pry bar through the spokes of the wheel and threw his weight against it. It shrieked and turned. A full rotation this time, then another, the oil in yesterday's work having broken the worst of the corrosion's grip. He spun it until it stopped hard against its limit, and then he heard, from deep inside the metal, a heavy mechanical clunk, the sound of a bolt the size of his arm sliding back. The door shifted. A line of black appeared along the seam, where before there had been only rust. Air sighed out of the gap, cold and stale and old, carrying a smell Caleb didn't recognize, dry and metallic and faintly, strangely sweet. He got his fingers into the gap and pulled. The door resisted, the hinges screaming, mud and rust raining down. He braced his feet and pulled with everything he had, and slowly, grudgingly, after 70 years sealed in the dark, the great metal door swung open, and Caleb Hartwell looked into the buried room his grandfather had been paid a fortune to forget. The work light hung from his hand, and he raised it, and its white beam pushed into the dark, and what it found there made him forget the cold, and the bank, and the man named Vance, and every other thing in the world. The smell came first, before his eyes made sense of anything, that dry metallic sweetness rolling out of the dark, and then the work light steadied and the inside of the buried room resolved out of 70 years of blackness, and Caleb forgot how to breathe. It was not a single room. The door opened onto a short metal vestibule, and beyond it a second door stood half ajar, and past that the space opened up larger than he'd guessed. A chamber maybe 30 feet long and 12 wide, the ceiling low enough that he'd have to stoop. The walls were lined with steel shelving, bolted in, and the shelves were full. His light moved across them and found, first, rows of wooden crates, dozens of them, each the size of a footlocker, banded with metal straps and stenciled with faded letters and numbers he couldn't read from where he crouched. Then, on the lower shelves, stacked like cordwood, dark oblong bars that the light caught and threw back in a dull yellow gleam that he knew, instantly, in his gut, before his mind would let him say the word. And beyond the crates and the bars, against the far wall, larger shapes draped in canvas and oilcloth, tall as a man, the cloth gone stiff and gray with age. Caleb stayed on his knees in the mouth of the vestibule for a long moment, the cold mud soaking through him, the light trembling in his hand, and he understood that whatever he had imagined finding, this was more. This was not a thing a man stumbled on. This was a thing that changed the shape of a life, for better or for worse, the moment he laid eyes on it. He went in. The floor of the chamber was dry, or nearly so, a low steel deck raised above the marsh bottom, and as he stepped down onto it from the muddy vestibule, his boots rang faintly on the metal. The air inside was close and stale and very cold, and the sweetness he'd smelled was stronger here, some preservative, he thought, some chemical they'd used to seal the place against the wet. He moved to the nearest shelf and put his light on the stenciling of a crate. The paint had faded to ghosts, but he could make out fragments. A string of numbers. A word that might have been property. Another, smaller, that he was nearly sure read Reich. He didn't understand it. Not then. He knew the word the way anyone knew it, from the edges of old movies and history class, but it meant nothing here, in an Ohio marsh, on his family's land. He set it aside and moved to the bars. There were a great many of them. He lifted one off the shelf, and the weight of it nearly took his arm off, far heavier than its size had any right to be, and he turned it in the light. There was no mistaking it now. The bar was gold. Crude, dark with age and tarnish, but gold, and stamped into its surface was an eagle, wings spread, and beneath the eagle's talons a circle, and within the circle a shape that the tarnish had nearly hidden, but that Caleb's thumb cleared as he rubbed it, and when he saw what it was he set the bar down fast, as if it had grown hot, and his skin crawled. A swastika. He stood in the cold buried room with his light moving over shelf after shelf of gold bars stamped with the broken cross, and rows of crates marked with words from a dead empire, and shrouded shapes against the wall that he had not yet found the nerve to uncover, and a single thought arranged itself in his mind, simple and enormous. This was Nazi gold. The phrase sounded absurd even in the privacy of his own skull, the kind of thing that belonged to movies and paperback thrillers, not to a man kneeling in the mud of a marsh his great-grandfather had cleared. And yet there it was, undeniable, in the dull gleam of the light, stamped into metal that did not lie. Caleb had grown up 40 miles from where they made the trucks that won the war his grandfather fought in. He'd stood, as a schoolboy, at the little memorial in the town square where the names of the Crane County dead were cut into granite, 11 of them, boys who'd gone off to Europe and the Pacific and never come home. He knew, in the dim general way of a man who'd paid attention in one good history class, what those broken crosses had meant, what had been done under them, the scale of the murder and the theft. And here was a fortune of it, the physical residue of all that horror, hidden under the ground his family had worked and prayed over and buried its own dead near, for 70 years, with a Hartwell standing guard over it the whole time, without knowing what he guarded. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He did not uncover the shapes against the wall that day. He didn't have it in him. He stood among the crates a while longer, his mind spinning too fast to hold any single thought, and then some instinct of self-preservation, the same instinct that had made him hide the tin box, told him to go, to get out, to be away from this thing before the dark and the cold, and the sheer weight of it overwhelmed him entirely. He backed out through the vestibule the way he'd come, and he pulled the great door closed behind him, and he spun the wheel until the bolts slid home, sealing it. And then he crawled back across the mud along his rope, and when he reached solid ground, he sat down hard in the dead cattails and put his head in his hands and shook. Nazi gold. In his marsh. Buried by men in a long black car in 1950, 5 years after the war ended, paid for with a fortune that bound his grandfather to silence for the rest of his life. He understood now. He understood all of it. The watching, the patience, the careful, polite menace of the man named Vance. You did not stumble onto a thing like this by accident and walk away rich. You stumbled onto a thing that men had killed for, and would kill for again, a thing whose very existence was a crime that someone, somewhere, had spent 70 years and untold money making sure stayed buried in the mud of a forgotten Ohio farm. And he was alone with it. One man, broke, mocked, abandoned, with a foreclosure clock running and no one in the world to call. That was the thought that nearly broke him, sitting there in the cold. The aloneness of it. There was no Sarah to talk it through with at the kitchen table. There was no father to ask. There was no one he could trust with a secret this size, because a secret this size made everyone who knew it dangerous, both to him and to themselves. He thought, wildly, of calling the police, and then thought of Vance saying we've kept an eye on the property over the years, and wondered how far the watching went, whether a county sheriff in a place like Crane County might be a man Vance's people could reach. He thought of calling the FBI, and didn't know how, didn't know what he'd even say, and was afraid, with the deep instinctive fear of a poor man, of what happened to people like him when they walked into the machinery of the powerful carrying a thing the powerful wanted. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He went home, and he washed the mud off, and he made himself eat, and he sat down at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pencil, the way his father used to do when a problem was too big to hold in his head, and he started to think it through. He needed to know what it was worth. That was first. A man couldn't make a plan without knowing the size of the thing he was planning around. He'd seen, dozens of bars. He hadn't counted, hadn't dared, but dozens, at least, and gold was gold. He knew the rough price of it. Everyone did. It was on the news. Even dozens of bars was a sum of money that made the $800 he'd borrowed for the pump look like loose change in a coat pocket. And that was just the gold he could see, just the part not still buried, just the bars and not the crates, not the shrouded shapes. The number, when he let himself reach for it, was so large it stopped meaning anything. It was a number that ended foreclosures. A number that bought back wives, almost, that secured daughters' whole lives, that erased in an afternoon 2 years of slow drowning. But he wrote the word on the pad and underlined it twice. But, because there was always a but, in Caleb's experience, always a catch, always a hand reaching out to take back what the world seemed to offer. And the buts here were as large as the number. He couldn't sell it. That was the first but, and it took him most of the night to fully grasp it. You could not walk into a coin shop with a Nazi gold bar and ask for the going rate. The thing was almost certainly stolen, looted, the property of governments and museums and the heirs of murdered people. And the moment Caleb tried to turn one bar into cash, he'd be a man trafficking in plundered war gold. And that was a crime, a federal crime, the kind that didn't care that he was broke or that his grandfather had been bought or that he just wanted to save his farm. The very thing that made it valuable made it untouchable. It was a fortune he could not spend, sitting in a marsh he could not keep. He thought, briefly, of the obvious dodge, of melting a bar down, of erasing the eagle and the cross, and turning damning history into anonymous gold that any dealer would take. He let himself follow the thought all the way to its end, the way a man lets himself imagine a sin before he refuses it. And he found that he could not do it, and the reason surprised him. It was the paintings he hadn't yet uncovered, the shrouded shapes against the wall, that stopped him, though he didn't fully understand why until later. There was a sense, growing in him, that the things in that vault were not treasure at all in the way he'd first thought, not a windfall, not luck. They were stolen from somebody. Every bar had been somebody's wedding ring once, somebody's spectacles, somebody's gold tooth. He'd read enough, even in his ignorance, to know how the Reich had made its gold. To melt a bar down was not to launder money. It was to finish the theft, to erase the last evidence of the people it had been taken from. And Caleb Hartwell, whatever else he was, whatever the bank thought of him and the town thought of him and his own wife had come to fear about him, was not going to be the man who did that. That was the second but. The farm. Even if by some miracle he found a way to turn the gold into money he could use, he had 89 days, now 88, before the bank began taking the land out from under him. And the gold was in the land. If the bank foreclosed, the marsh went with everything else, and whatever was buried in it became someone else's problem, the bank's, or whoever bought the property at auction, and Caleb walked away with nothing, having found the greatest fortune of his life, and lost it in the same season. And the third but was Vance. Vance and the people he represented, who knew the gold was there, who had watched the farm for 70 years to keep it there, and who had come, polite and smiling, the moment they saw a pump in the marsh, to offer Caleb generous compensation for his silence and cooperation. They knew. They didn't know he'd opened it. Not yet. But they knew it was there, and they were not going to let one desperate farmer simply take it. The card in his pocket was not an offer. It was a leash. And the moment Caleb tugged against it, the moment he tried to do anything with what he'd found other than what Vance wanted, the smiling would stop. He sat at the table until the candle of his strength burned all the way down, and the conclusion he reached was bleak and clear. He had found a fortune that he could not sell, on land he was about to lose, guarded by men who would hurt him if he tried to take it. By every ordinary measure, he was no better off than he'd been a week ago. He was worse off, in fact, because now he was a man who knew a deadly secret, and knowing it had made him a target. And yet, he found, somewhere past midnight, that he was not despairing. That surprised him. 2 years of slow loss had taught him the taste of despair very well, and this was not it. What he felt instead, faint but real, was something closer to the feeling he'd had kneeling in the mud at the wheel. The feeling of a door. Because a thing that powerful men wanted this badly was a thing that gave a powerless man, for once in his life, something to bargain with. He didn't have to sell the gold. He just had to be the man who controlled it, the man who knew where it was and what it was, the man whose silence or whose speech could undo 70 years of careful burial. That was worth something. That was worth, maybe, everything. He just had to be smart enough, and careful enough, and brave enough to play a hand he had never in his life been dealt. He went to bed as the sky grayed, and for the first time in a long time he slept without dreaming, the deep sleep of a man who has finally, after a long fall, felt the ground. In the morning he began, methodically, to learn. He couldn't go to the county library, where the librarian had known him since he was a boy and would remember anything unusual he looked into. So he drove the 40 miles to the small city where the regional library sat, a place where he was no one, and he spent the day at a public computer in a back corner, and he taught himself, hour by hour, the shape of the thing he'd found. He learned that in the last months of the war, as the Reich collapsed, enormous quantities of looted gold and art and currency had been hidden, scattered, smuggled out of Germany through 100 channels, much of it never recovered. He learned that some of it had gone to South America, and some to Switzerland, and some, the rumors said, the persistent, unprovable rumors, to the United States, carried by men who'd traded the gold for new identities and a quiet life, or by other men, darker men, who'd helped them do it for a price. He learned the word that the historians used, a word that made his skin crawl all over again. Routlands. The escape routes. The networks of people who'd moved Nazis and Nazi treasure out of the ruins of Europe and into the wide forgetting of the post-war world. He learned, reading between the lines of careful academic prose, that some of those networks had never really gone away, that the money laundered through them had built fortunes that still existed, held by families and front companies and institutions that had every reason in the world to keep the source of their wealth hidden. And he understood, sitting in the quiet library with the afternoon light coming through the high windows, that Vance was a man who worked for people like that. People whose comfortable modern lives sat on a foundation of plundered gold, and who could not afford, ever, for one bar of it to surface and start the long unraveling of where it had come from, and who had moved it, and how. That was why they watched. Not just to keep the gold, to keep the secret of themselves. He learned one thing more. Near the end of the day, that changed everything. He searched, on a hunch, for unsolved disappearances and unexplained deaths connected to Nazi gold rumors, and he found a thin scattering of stories from across the decades. A treasure hunter who'd vanished in the Bavarian Alps, a journalist who died in a single-car accident the week before publishing an investigation, a retired customs official found drowned, who'd spent his last years claiming to know where a shipment had gone. None of it was proof of anything. All of it could be coincidence. But laid side by side, in the failing afternoon light, the stories told Caleb a truth he could feel in his bones. People who got close to this did not stay safe. The watching was not the worst that Vance's people did. It was only the first thing. There was one more thing he found, almost by accident, that he sat staring at for a long time. A scholarly article, dry and footnoted, about a shipment of looted gold that records suggested had been moved out of Europe in 1949 and 1950 through a port on the Atlantic coast, and had then simply vanished from history, never recovered, its fate unknown. The author, a professor at some university, had written that the shipment was believed to have been broken up and dispersed, possibly within the United States, by a network whose members had never been identified, and that its recovery would represent, in the author's careful words, one of the most significant resolutions of an open wartime asset case in decades. The dates lined up. 1949, 1950. The very years his grandfather had bought the farm and then, a year later, taken the money and let the men in the long black car bury something in his marsh. Caleb read the article 3 times. He wasn't a scholar. He couldn't be sure. But sitting in that quiet library 40 miles from home, he felt the pieces slide together with a click he could almost hear, and he understood that what lay under his marsh was not just a fortune, and not just a danger, but a hole in the record of the world, a thing that history itself had been waiting 80 years to find. He drove home in the dark, checking the mirror, and the fear was a steady cold companion now, no longer a thread but a presence in the truck beside him. When he came up the lane, the house was dark, as he'd left it, but something was wrong. He knew it before he could say what. He sat in the truck a moment in the yard, engine off, every sense straining. And then he saw it. The kitchen door, which he'd locked, stood an inch open, a black line down its edge. Caleb sat very still. Then he reached under the seat, where his father's old framing hammer had ridden for years, and he closed his hand around the worn handle, and he got out of the truck as quietly as he could and crossed the yard. The house had been searched. He could see it the moment he stepped inside and put on the light. Not ransacked, nothing so crude, but searched, carefully, by people who'd wanted him to know they'd been there. The drawers of the roll-top desk were open. The papers were stacked too neatly, in an order that wasn't his. A kitchen chair had been moved, and on the kitchen table, set square in the center where he couldn't miss it, was Vance's card. The same card Caleb had left in his coat pocket, which meant they'd been through his coat, which meant they'd been through everything, which meant they were telling him, with the silent eloquence of professionals, that there was nowhere in this house they could not reach. He stood holding the hammer, his heart slamming, and he understood the message perfectly. They'd searched for the proof. They'd found his grandfather's desk and gone through it, and found nothing, because the tin box was in the barn wall, behind the loose board, where his father used to keep the bridles. They didn't have the papers, but they wanted him to know they'd looked, and that they could look again, anywhere, anytime, and that the polite phase of things was passing. He went through the house room by room, the hammer still in his hand, the light coming on ahead of him in each doorway. They'd been thorough, and they'd been clean. In the bedroom, the closet had been gone through, the shoeboxes on the shelf opened and stacked back, not quite right. In Emma's room, which Caleb kept exactly as she'd left it, the small bed made, the stuffed rabbit on the pillow, someone had pulled the dresser drawers out and pushed them back in, and the sight of that, of a stranger's hands in his little girl's empty room, did something to Caleb that the parking lot and the search desk had not. It took the fear and forged it into something harder. They had stood in his daughter's room. They had opened the drawers where her summer clothes still waited for a child who didn't live here anymore. And then they had gone down to the kitchen and laid a card on the table to let him know they'd done it. He should have been more frightened than he was. Some part of him was screaming. But underneath the fear, hard and cold and steadying, was a flat farmer's anger that he recognized as the oldest thing in him, the thing that had kept Hartwells on this land for 3 generations against drought and debt and falling prices and every other force that had tried to pry them loose. They'd come into his father's house. They'd gone through his dead mother's desk. They'd put a card on the table where his daughter used to eat her breakfast, to threaten him. And the anger said, very quietly, beneath the fear, no. He did not call the number on the card. Instead, he did 3 things over the next 2 days, moving with a deliberateness that surprised him. A man who had spent 2 years unable to decide anything now suddenly, terribly clear. The first thing he did was photograph everything. He went back out to the marsh, in the cold dawn before any car was likely to come, and he opened the vault, and this time he made himself stay, and he documented it. He used the cracked old phone that was the only camera he owned, and he photographed the shelves, the crates in there. Faded stenciling, the gold bars with their eagles and their broken crosses, every angle he could manage in the bad light. He photographed the serial numbers and markings on a dozen of the bars. He worked fast and methodically, his breath fogging in the work light's beam. One ear always turned toward the marsh's edge for the sound of an engine, because he knew that if Vance's people caught him here, inside the open vault with a phone full of photographs, the conversation would not be a polite one, and there would be no card left on a table. Every minute in that cold metal room was a minute he was completely exposed, half a mile from the house, with only a rope and 2 planks between him and the mud, and no way out that a fast man couldn't cut off. He counted the bars as he photographed them, made himself do it, and the number he reached made his hands shake so badly he had to stop and steady the phone against a shelf. And then, finally, his hands not quite steady, he uncovered the shrouded shapes against the far wall. They were paintings, framed canvases, a dozen of them or more, stacked and wrapped. And when he peeled back the stiff oilcloth from the first, he found himself looking at a woman's face, pale against a dark background, painted with a delicacy that stopped his breath even in his ignorance, even in that cold and dreadful place. He didn't know art. He couldn't have named the painter if his life depended on it. But he knew, the way he'd known the gold was gold, that this was a thing of enormous worth. And he understood that the looted Reich had not stolen only gold but the cultural treasure of a whole continent, the paintings off the walls of murdered families, and that some fraction of all that vanished beauty had ended its long journey here, in the dark under his marsh, wrapped in oilcloth, waiting. He knelt in front of the painted woman a long moment, longer than the cold and the danger should have allowed. There was a small brass plate set into the bottom of the frame, and he wiped the tarnish from it, and there was a name engraved there, a family name, and a date, and Caleb understood that this had hung in someone's home once, that the woman in the painting had been somebody, a wife or a mother or a daughter, and that the family whose name was on the frame had likely been swallowed whole by the same machine that stamped the broken cross into the gold downstairs. He thought about his own family pictures, the ones on the walls of the house above him, his grandfather in uniform, his parents young and alive, himself at 7 holding a fish. He thought about what it would mean for those pictures to be torn off the walls and crated and lost, for the whole family to be erased, and only the stolen images of them to survive, sealed in the dark on a stranger's land. Something turned over in his chest, kneeling there, and the last of whatever greed had flickered in him that first night went out for good. This was not his to keep or to sell. It had owners, even if the owners were dead, even if the only thing left of them was a name on a brass plate. It belonged to them, and to their children if they had any, and to the world that had grieved them. His job, he understood now, was only to be the man who finally brought it back up out of the water. He photographed the paintings, and then he covered them again, gently, with a care he didn't fully understand, as if they were owed it, and he sealed the vault and went back to the house. The second thing he did was hide the photographs. He didn't trust the phone, didn't trust anything in the house after the search. So he drove back to the regional city and found a place that printed photos, and he had 2 copies made of every image, and he mailed one set to himself care of a post office box he opened under his own name in a town where no one knew him, and the other set he sealed in a freezer bag and buried, with the tin box he retrieved from the barn wall, in a coffee can under a fence post at the far corner of the property, a spot he'd remember and no searcher would ever find. Proof. The only leverage the powerless ever got. He was not going to be a man who got close to this and didn't stay safe. He was going to be a man who'd thought ahead. The third thing he did was the hardest, and he sat with it for a long time before he could make himself begin. He had decided he could not do this alone. He had understood that the night at the kitchen table, A lone broke farmer against a 70-year-old network of laundered money had no chance. None, no matter how much proof he buried under fence posts. He needed help. Real help. From someone outside Crane County, outside the reach of the watching, someone with the power to stand between him and Vance's people and the knowledge to turn a buried fortune into a future he could actually live in. The trouble was that he didn't know anyone like that, had never in his life moved in circles that contained anyone like that. He was a man whose entire world was 40 miles wide. But Sarah's sister, Diane, with whom Sarah and Emma now lived, was married to a man named Robert Okafor, and Robert was a lawyer. Not a country lawyer who did wills and property closings, but a real one, a partner in a firm in Columbus that did things Caleb didn't fully understand, corporate things, the kind of law that involved governments and large sums of money. Caleb had met him 3 times, at the wedding and at 2 strained holidays, and they had never had a real conversation, the gulf between a city lawyer and a failing farmer being what it was. Robert had always been polite to him, in a careful, distant way, the way you were polite to the relative everyone privately worried about. Caleb had resented it, a little, the way a proud man resents being pitted. But Robert was, as far as Caleb could see, the only person in the entire orbit of his life who was outside the small world Vance's people seemed able to touch, and who might know what a man was supposed to do when he found a thing like this. And reaching Robert meant reaching Sarah, which meant a conversation Caleb had been avoiding for 11 months, which meant, also, he made himself admit, sitting with the phone in his hand, putting Sarah and Diane and Emma somewhere in the vicinity of a thing that powerful men killed to protect. That stopped him cold for a full day. The thought of pulling Emma anywhere near this. He nearly didn't make the call because of it. But the truth, when he finally faced it, was that they were already near it. All of them. The moment he opened that door, because he was Emma's father and Sarah's husband still in the eyes of the law and the family. And if Vance's people decided to use leverage of their own, they would not have to look far to find what Caleb loved. The only real protection for any of them was to get the thing out into the light, fast, into the hands of people too big and too official for Vance to silence, before the network decided that a polite leash had failed and something harder was called for. Hiding made them targets. Speed and daylight were the only safety. So on the 3rd evening, Caleb drove out to the county road where there was a gas station with a pay phone bolted to the wall, an old thing left over from another age, and he fed it quarters from the dwindling money in his wallet. And he dialed the number he'd kept all these months and never used, the number of Sarah's sister's house, where his wife and daughter slept. Sarah answered on the 4th ring. Her voice, when she said hello, did something to him that he wasn't ready for, opened a door in his chest he'd kept shut for the better part of a year, and for a moment he couldn't speak. He had rehearsed this call a dozen times in his head on the drive out to the gas station, and every rehearsal had begun with an apology, because that was what he owed her, 11 months of it, for the slow drowning she'd had to watch and the silence he'd kept, and the way he'd loved a piece of dirt more loudly than he'd ever managed to love her out loud. But now that her voice was actually in his ear, all the rehearsed words went out of him, and what was left was just the plain animal need of a frightened man for the one person who'd ever truly known him. Caleb, she said, into the silence. She'd known it was him somehow. Caleb, is that you? Is everything all right? No, he said. The word came out rough. Then, because it was true, and because he was done lying, to her or to himself, he said it again. No, it's not. Sarah, I need help. I'm in trouble, real trouble, and it's not the bank, it's worse than the bank, and I don't have anyone else to call. He heard her go still on the other end. He braced for the weariness, the gentle, terrible sorrow, the voice that would tell him that his troubles were his own now, that she couldn't drown with him anymore, and that she would be right to say it. It didn't come. What came instead, after a moment, was a different Sarah, the one he'd married, the one from before the long defeat, sharp and present in there. Tell me, she said, from the start. Don't leave anything out. And standing at the pay phone on the county road in the cold dark, with the truck idling behind him and the marsh half a mile away holding its terrible fortune and the watchers somewhere out in the night, Caleb Hartwell told his wife everything. The pump, the shape in the mud, the tin box, and his grandfather's confession. The gold with its broken crosses, the paintings, the crates marked with the words of a dead empire. Vance in the parking lot, and the searched house, and the card on the kitchen table. The disappearances he'd read about. The buried proof. All of it, in a low, fast voice, while the quarters ran down, and Sarah listened without once interrupting. And when he was done, there was a long silence on the line. When she spoke again, her voice had changed once more, gone soft and careful in a way that frightened him more than sharpness would have. "You found the Marsh thing," she said slowly. "The thing your dad would never let you go near. Caleb, do you remember? God, do you remember the night you proposed to me, out by that bottom ground? And you said someday when the farm came good you'd build me a house on the rise where you could see the whole place?" She made a sound that was half a laugh and half something else. "I always thought that Marsh was just sad. Just wasted ground that broke your family's heart a little. I never thought." She stopped. "Caleb, are you safe right now? Tonight?" "I think so," he said. "I don't know. I'm putting Robert on," she said. "Don't argue. He's right here. He's been listening to my half of this. And his face." She stopped. "Just talk to him, Caleb. Please." There was a fumbling sound, and then a new voice, deeper, careful. The voice Caleb remembered from the strained holidays, but stripped now of its careful distance. "Caleb," Robert said. "It's Robert. I want you to listen to me very carefully, because what you've just described to my wife, if even half of it is what you think it is one of the most dangerous things a person can be in possession of, and also, potentially, one of the most important. I need you to do exactly 3 things between now and tomorrow morning, and then I'm going to get in my car. Can you do that?" Caleb closed his eyes. The relief of it, the simple, unbearable relief of not being alone, went through him like warmth into frozen hands, and it hurt the way the thawing always hurt. "Yeah," he said. "Tell me what to do." Robert told him. He told him to stay in the house tonight with the doors locked and the truck where he could reach it, and not to go near the marsh again until Robert arrived. He told him that the buried proof was the smartest thing Caleb had done, and that he was not under any circumstances to dig it up or move it or tell another living soul where it was. And he told him, his voice dropping, that he had handled exactly one matter adjacent to this world, years ago, a question of provenance on a contested estate, and that he knew, from that, the name of a person Caleb's situation needed, a person at a federal agency whose entire job was the recovery of looted wartime assets, a person who could not be reached by men like Vance because she answered to a government, and who would, Robert was nearly certain, drop everything to get on a plane the moment she understood what was sitting in an Ohio marsh. "Her name is Diane Reyes," Robert said. "No relation to our Diane. She runs a unit that almost nobody's heard of, and she has spent 20 years chasing exactly the kind of thing you're describing and almost never getting to put her hands on it, because by the time anyone finds this material, it's usually already been laundered, broken up, scattered through the art market and the gold market until it can't be traced. An intact cache, in situ, with documentation, with a chain of custody you can actually establish back to 1950, with a living witness's confession in a tin box. Caleb, I want you to understand. That is the thing she has dreamed about her entire career. You are not a man begging for help here. You are a man holding the most important phone call of her professional life. When I reach her in the morning, she is going to move heaven and earth, and she is going to bring people with her, the kind of people Vance's clients cannot intimidate. And the safest place you can possibly be is standing next to them when the story breaks. He paused, and when he went on his voice was lower still. But I need you to hear the other half of this too, because I won't lie to you, not about something this size. There's a window between now and when she arrives, where you are the only thing standing between these people and the only physical evidence that can undo 80 years of their cover. Right now they think they can manage you. They searched your house to scare you, and they're waiting to see if you'll fold and call the number. If they realize you've already opened it, already documented it, already reached out for help, that's the dangerous moment, Caleb. That's when managing you stops looking cheaper than the alternative. So you keep quiet, you keep still, you keep that proof buried, and you let them keep believing they have time. One more night. Can you give me one more night? You found it, Caleb, Robert said, near the end, and there was something in his voice that Caleb had never heard directed at him before, something like respect. Out of everyone in this family, it landed on you. The man he stopped himself. The man we worried about. You found a thing that historians have spent 80 years looking for, and instead of grabbing a bar and running and getting yourself killed, you photographed it and buried the proof and called for help. Do you understand that that was exactly right? Do you understand how few people would have done that? Caleb didn't answer. He couldn't. He was thinking of Dale Brunner laughing in the feed store, "You'll have nothing," and the whole county shaking its head over the Hartwell boy draining the devil's bathtub, and his father's faithful unknowing rule, and his grandfather's shame. The day he came, "God forgive me for what I agreed to." He was thinking that for 2 years he had been a man to whom things were done, the bank and the prices and the leaving, a man who lost. And that in the space of 1 week he had become, without quite meaning to, a man who held something that the powerful wanted and could not simply take. He didn't feel rich. He felt, for the first time since Sarah drove away with Emma's car seat in the back, like he mattered. Like the things he did changed what happened next. "I'll do it," he said finally. "Whatever your person says. Robert, I need you to understand. I'm not doing this for the money." He surprised himself, saying it, and found it was true. "I can't even sell the stuff, I know that now. I'm doing it because they came in my house. They put a card on the table where my little girl used to eat. And because my grandfather took their money 70 years ago, and it cost this family something I'm only now seeing the size of. And I think the only way to ever be free of them is to drag the whole thing out into the light where they can't bury it again. I want it gone. I want it given to whoever it really belongs to. And I want my farm and my family, and to never see a man like Vance again as long as I live." There was a silence on the line. Then Robert said, quietly, "That's the right thing to want. And it's also, as it happens, the only thing that's likely to keep you alive. The people who hold treasure like this can be bought or frightened. A man who gives it to the United States government has nothing left to take and nothing left to threaten over. You make yourself worthless to them by giving everything away." He paused. "Sarah's right about you, you know. She always said there was more iron in you than you let on. I'm starting to think she undersold it." They talked a few minutes more, working out the details, when Robert would arrive and where they'd meet, so as not to bring a stranger's car straight up the lane in daylight. And then, before he hung up, Caleb asked the thing he'd been holding back the whole call, the only thing that had ever really mattered. "Is Emma there?" he said. "Is she up? I know it's late." A pause. Then Sarah's voice again, soft. "She's asleep, Caleb. But she's right down the hall. She's safe. Diane and I won't let her out of our sight. And Robert's calling people first thing. We've got her. Sheila, eh? Beat pass. You can tell her yourself. When this is over. You can tell her daddy found buried treasure and gave it to the whole world and saved the farm and didn't get a scratch. That's the version you're going to live, do you hear me? That's the only version I'll accept." Caleb stood at the pay phone with the cold coming up off the asphalt and the stars hard and bright over the bare fields. And he found that his face was wet, and he was glad there was no one to see it. "Yeah," he said. "That's the version." He hung up the phone and drove home. And he checked the mirror the whole way, and there were no headlights behind him. But he knew, now, that the absence of headlights didn't mean he wasn't being watched. He went into the dark house and locked the doors and sat in the kitchen with his father's hammer on the table and the lights off, watching the foot of the lane through the window, waiting for morning and for Robert and for the woman from the government, whose job it was to bring buried things into the light. It was a strange vigil. The house ticked and settled around him the way it had every night of his life. The same sounds he'd fallen asleep to as a boy, the furnace cycling, the wind finding the loose pane in the upstairs hall, the old beams easing as the cold deepened. But tonight every sound was a question. He found himself thinking, in the long dark hours, about how many nights his grandfather must have sat in this same kitchen after the men came, listening the way Caleb was listening now, a fortune buried at the bottom of his land, and a fear sat permanently down in his chest like a stone. 70 years his family had lived above this thing. 3 generations had eaten and slept and grieved and raised their children directly upslope from a horde of plundered death, and only his grandfather had known. And the knowing had bent the old man into a shape of secrecy and shame that he'd passed down without ever explaining. Caleb felt, sitting there, a strange tenderness for the grandfather he barely remembered, and underneath it a hard new resolve. The fear ended with him. Whatever happened, his daughter was not going to inherit a stone in her chest, and a line on a map and a rule she didn't understand. He was going to drag the thing up into the daylight and be free of it, all of them free of it, even if it cost him the farm, even if it cost him more than that. He must have dozed, sometime in the small hours, slumped in the kitchen chair, because he came awake all at once with his heart hammering and the certain knowledge that something had changed. For a moment he didn't know what. Then he understood. It was a smell. Faint, wrong, threading in through the old house's gaps. Smoke. He was on his feet before he'd finished waking, the hammer in his hand, and he went to the window over the sink and looked out toward the lane, and he saw nothing. And then he turned and looked the other way, down the slope, toward the dark mass of the equipment shed and the barn, and beyond them, half a mile off, the marsh. There was a light down there, a flickering orange light, low to the ground, at the edge of the marsh where his planks and his rope and his rented pump all sat. And as he watched, frozen, hammer in hand, the light grew and reached up and became unmistakably what it was. Fire. Someone was down at the marsh in the dead of night, and they had set a fire, and Caleb understood with a sick lurch that the polite phase was over, that the leash had been cut, that Vance's people had not waited for morning or for lawyers or for anything at all, and that whatever was about to happen at the bottom of his land was going to happen now, in the dark, with no one to see and no one to help, and the nearest person who knew the truth 4 hours away on a highway he hadn't even reached. Yet, Caleb grabbed the truck keys off the hook and ran. The cold hit him the moment he came off the porch, but he barely felt it. He went down the slope at a dead run, the truck keys forgotten in his fist, his boots slipping on the frost-stiff grass, the orange light at the bottom of the land growing as he ran. He could see it clearly now. The fire was at the marsh's edge, where his rented pump sat, and the pump was burning, a column of flame and black smoke rising off it into the windless dark, the diesel in its tank feeding the blaze. And there were figures, 2 of them, dark shapes against the fire, and a third standing back near a vehicle Caleb hadn't heard come up the back lane, the old track that ran in from the county road along the creek, the one a man would use if he didn't want to be seen coming up the front. Caleb stopped halfway down the slope, his chest heaving, and crouched low in the dead grass. Some animal sense had taken over, the same sense that had pulled his leg out of the sucking mud. He was one man with a hammer. There were 3 of them, and they had come in the dark, the way men come when they mean to do a thing no one is supposed to see. Running into the firelight would accomplish nothing but to put him in front of them. He watched. The 2 figures by the pump weren't trying to put the fire out. They were standing over it, watching it burn, and then one of them turned and walked out along Caleb's planks, the bridge he'd laid across the mud, with something in his hand. A can. And Caleb understood, with a lurch of pure horror, what they were doing. They weren't here for him. Not first. They were going to the vault. They were going to pour fuel down into that buried room and burn it. The gold and the crates and the paintings, the woman's face on the canvas with the brass plate and the family name. All of it. 80 years of stolen history. Set a light in the bottom of an Ohio marsh so that there would be nothing left to find, nothing to trace, nothing to undo. The long burial. Burn the evidence. The oldest move there was. The man named Vance had even told him, in the parking lot, in his smooth voice. We'll make it go away. Quietly. Caleb did not think. He moved. He kept low and ran along the slope, away from the fire, to where the equipment shed sat dark, and he went in through the side door he never locked, and his hands found in the blackness the things he knew were there, because he had grown up in this shed, because his father had died in it, because he could have walked it blind. He found the air horn his father had used to call the hands in from the far fields, a canister the size of a thermos with a trumpet on top, loud enough to be heard for 2 miles on a still day. He found the work lights, the big halogen banks on their tripod that he used for night repairs, and the long extension cord, and the gas generator. And he found, on its hook, the thing he'd come for most, the old single-shot shotgun his father had kept for groundhogs and coyotes, and the box of shells beside it. And he loaded it with hands that had gone very steady, the way they always did at the worst moments, some deep Hartwell stillness coming over him. He couldn't fight 3 men, but he didn't have to. He just had to make the dark loud and bright and full of witnesses where there were none, had to make these men believe, for the few hours until Dawn and Robert and the woman from the government, that the quiet they needed was gone. Men who did their work in the dark could not abide the light. He set the generator going and the halogen banks blazed to life, throwing a flood of white across the whole bottom of the land. The marsh, the fire, the 3 figures, all of it suddenly lit up like a stage. He saw them freeze and turn. And then Caleb stood up out of the grass at the top of the slope, while back, the shotgun in one hand and the air horn in the other, and he leaned on the horn, and the sound of it tore across the night, enormous, endless, a sound that would carry to the Brunner place and beyond, a sound that said someone is awake, someone sees you. This is not a quiet place anymore. He fired the shotgun once into the air, the flat crack rolling out over the fields, and then he reloaded and screamed into the night at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with fury and fear, that he saw them, that he had the law coming, that they could burn his pump, but they would not get near that marsh, not tonight, not while he was breathing. It was a bluff, most of it. The law was not coming, not yet, not until Dawn brought Robert up the lane. But Caleb had farmed his whole life beside men like these, men who calculated, and he understood the one thing that would move them. They were not afraid of him. One farmer with an old gun was nothing to men who could vanish and never be found. What they were afraid of was being seen, and the longer the lights burned and the horn screamed and the gunshot echoed, the more certain it became that they were being seen, that somewhere a neighbor was at a window with a phone, that a thing meant to happen in total darkness was now happening in a blaze of halogen light, with a witness shouting from the slope. Their whole power was secrecy. Caleb could not outfight them. But he could, for one night, with a generator and a horn, take their secrecy away. For a long moment, everything hung. The 3 figures stood in the white light, caught, and Caleb could see them debating it, could feel them weighing whether one farmer with a horn and an old gun was worth the risk now that the dark had been ripped open, now that a shotgun had gone off, and an air horn was still screaming, and any neighbor for 2 miles was sitting up in bed reaching for a phone. The man near the vehicle, the one standing back, made a sharp gesture, and the 2 by the pump came in off the planks, fast, and one of them paused at the marsh's edge and looked up the slope directly at Caleb, a long flat look across 100 yards of lit grass, the look of a man memorizing a face for later. Then the 3 of them got into the dark vehicle on the back lane, and it reversed hard down the track without lights, and was gone. Caleb stood at the top of the slope with the horn finally silent, and the generator roaring, and the pump still burning itself out below, and he shook so hard he had to sit down. He'd done it. He'd held them off. But his pump was gone. $600 of borrowed money turned to slag, and they knew now, they had to know, that he'd lit the place up rather than let them near it, which meant they knew he understood what was down there, which meant the next time they came, if there was a next time, they would not come in the dark to be scared off by a horn. The window Robert had spoken of had just slammed most of the way shut. He did not sleep again. He sat at the top of the slope in the cab of his truck with the shotgun across his knees and the halogen lights burning his last gallon of generator gas, watching the marsh and the back lane both, until the eastern sky went from black to gray to the thin cold pink of an April dawn. It was the longest night of his life, longer than the night he'd read the foreclosure letter, longer than the night Sarah's note had waited for him on the table. He kept the truck radio low for company and watched the dark and thought, against his will, of his grandfather sitting up in the house behind him 70 years ago, curtains drawn, while different men did different work out in the same marsh. The symmetry of it sat strange and heavy in him. His grandfather had stayed inside and let it happen and taken the money and lived the rest of his life with the shame of it. Caleb had come out into the dark with a horn and a gun and stood between the men and the thing they'd come to destroy. The same Marsh. The same family. The same. Midnight. 2 men, 3 generations apart, and the difference between them was only this, that one had been bought and one would not be. Caleb hoped, somewhere in those hours, that wherever his grandfather was, the old man could see it and could finally, after all this time, set the shame down. And as the light came up, he saw, far off on the county road, a single car turn in at the foot of the front lane and come slowly up toward the house. He gripped the gun. Then he saw it was a rental, a clean sedan with 2 people in it. And the passenger door opened before it had fully stopped and a man got out, tall, in a rumpled suit he'd clearly slept in. And it was Robert, for hours of highway behind him, his face gray with worry. And Caleb got out of the truck and the 2 of them stood looking at each other across the frosted yard. And then Robert crossed the distance and gripped Caleb hard by both shoulders and didn't say anything at all. And Caleb found that he was crying again and didn't care. The other person was already on the phone. She was a small woman in her 50s, gray hair cut short, a heavy coat over traveling clothes. And she stood by the rental car talking fast and low into her phone while her eyes moved over the farm. The burn pump still smoking at the bottom of the slope, the halogen lights, the shotgun in Caleb's hand, taking it all in, missing nothing. When she finished the call, she came across the yard and put out her hand. "Caleb Hartwell," she said. "Diane Reyes. Robert reached me at 1 in the morning, and I have not stopped moving since." She looked past him, down the slope, to the marsh and the smoking pump. "Tell me they didn't get to it." "They didn't," Caleb said. "I stopped them." He heard how it sounded and almost laughed. With an air horn. Something flickered across Diane Reyes's face, and it took Caleb a moment to recognize it, because it had been a long time since anyone had looked at him that way. It was admiration. "An air horn," she repeated. "Mr. Hartwell, I have spent 22 years arriving 3 weeks too late. 3 weeks, 3 months, 30 years too late, every single time, to find the gold melted, the paintings sold through 6 countries, the trail cold, the witnesses dead. I have stood in 100 empty rooms where the thing used to be." She looked down the slope again, at the marsh holding its terrible intact secret. "You stopped them with an air horn." She shook her head slowly. Show me everything. And then I am going to make some calls that are going to change your life." What followed, over the next 3 days, was the strangest and most crowded time of Caleb Hartwell's life. By that first afternoon, there were federal vehicles parked all up the lane, dark SUVs, and a mobile command trailer, and, by evening, 2 state police cruisers stationed at the foot of the property, because Diane Reyes had explained the situation to people above her in a way that made the situation everyone's problem, and a guarded crime scene was a thing that men like Vance could not burn or buy. Caleb gave his statement 4 times to 4 different people. He led a team and waiters out across the mud to the vault, walking the planks he'd laid himself, and he stood back and watched as people who knew what they were looking at went into the buried room and came out changed, the way he'd come out changed, pale and quiet, and full of a thing too big to say. He gave them the proof. He dug up the coffee can from under the fence post himself, with Reyes and Robert standing beside him in the gray morning, and he handed over the tin box with his grandfather's confession and the photograph marked the day he came, and the freezer bag of printed photographs, and he told them about the second set in the post office box. Reyes took the tin box in her gloved hands as if it were made of glass, and she read his grandfather's letter standing right there in the field, and when she finished, she looked at Caleb with her eyes wet. "Do you have any idea," she said, "how rare this is? Not the gold. The gold is extraordinary, but it's the gold that everyone dreams about. This." She held up the letter. "A documented chain of custody. A named witness. A date. A reason. People find caches all the time with no story, no provenance, nothing but metal, and we spend a decade in court and the heirs of the murdered never see $1 of it because we can't prove where it came from. But your grandfather wrote it down. He couldn't live with it, so he wrote it down and hid it, and you found it, and you didn't burn it to protect his name. Do you understand what you've handed me? You've handed me the one thing this work almost never has. The truth, written down, by a man who was there. It took experts another 2 days to begin to grasp the scope of it, and weeks more to confirm, but the rough shape of it came clear fast, and the numbers, when they reached Caleb, did not feel real. The gold alone, when they counted and weighed it, came to a figure that made his head swim, north of $200 million at the price of the metal, and that was before anyone accounted for the historical premium, the fact that some of these bars were of a type museums had searched for since the war. The paintings were worse or better, depending on how you looked at it. 3 of them, Reyes told him quietly, sitting at his kitchen table on the third night, were works that the art world had listed as lost since 1943, paintings that scholars had written entire papers about, mourned, assumed destroyed in the bombing. One of them, the woman with the brass plate, the one Caleb had knelt in front of, was worth, by itself, more than all the gold. The total, when the appraisers and the historians and the insurers were finally done, ran past $400 million, and even that number, Reyes said, undersold it. Because some of what was in that vault was beyond price, the kind of thing that did not have a market because it should never have been on a market in the first place. And the crates. The crates were the thing that broke Caleb's heart when they finally opened them. They were not all gold and treasure. Some of them held records, ledgers, lists, the meticulous, monstrous paperwork of the theft itself, the inventories the Reich had kept of what it took and from whom, names and addresses, and the careful notation of confiscated property, a bureaucracy of plunder. And those records, Reyes told him, his hands shaking around a coffee cup he wasn't drinking, those records were how the families would be found. The actual families. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people the gold had been melted from and the paintings stolen from. Because of the crates, because his grandfather had let men bury their own evidence on Hartwell land and Caleb had refused to let them burn it, descendants scattered across 3 continents who had grown up with a hole in their family's history were going to receive, after 80 years, a letter that began with the words, "We have found something that belonged to your family." Reyes explained to him, slowly, over those 3 days, how it would work. The gold would be tested and traced, the markings cross-referenced against the very ledgers found in the crates, and where a bar could be tied to a confiscation record, the value would go to the heirs of the family it had been taken from, and where it could not, to the international funds set up for exactly this purpose, the funds that helped survivors and the children of survivors. The paintings would be researched, their provenance reconstructed, and returned, every one, to the families who could prove their grandparents had owned them, or to the museums that held them in trust for a public that had mourned them as lost. None of it, not one bar, not one canvas, would go to a private collection or a vault or another long burial. It would all come up into the light and stay there. That's the work, Reyes said, on the last evening, the 2 of them sitting in the kitchen while the federal vehicles thinned out down the lane. That's the whole work. Not finding the gold. Anyone with a metal detector and luck can find gold. The work is putting it back, closing the circle, telling a woman in Buenos Aires or a man in Tel Aviv that the thing the war took from their family wasn't gone after all, that it was waiting in the mud in Ohio, that somebody found it and could have kept it and didn't. She looked at Caleb a long moment. You have no idea how many of those letters I've wanted to write in my career and couldn't, because the gold was already melted, the painting already sold, the trail already cold. You just handed me dozens of them. She set down her cup. I've met a lot of people in this work, Mr. Hartwell. Treasure hunters, mostly, and dealers, and the kind of lawyers who circle these things like sharks. You're the first finder I've ever met who, the moment he understood what he had, started thinking about who to give it back to. I want you to know that. Whatever the town says about you, whatever the papers say, I want you to know that's rare. That's the rarest thing in this whole business. Rarer than the gold. That was the moment, Caleb would say later, when he stopped thinking of any of it as treasure at all. The men were never fully named, the people Vance worked for. That was the one thing that did not resolve cleanly, the way such things rarely do. Vance himself vanished, the card and its number leading to a shell that led to another shell that led, eventually, to nothing anyone could put in handcuffs. But Reyes told Caleb, near the end, that the surfacing of the cash had done more damage to the network than any arrest could have. Once the records were out, once the world knew the shipment had been found and the provenance established, the careful invisibility that those families and front companies had maintained for 80 years was finished. The thing they had killed and watched and waited 3 generations to keep buried was now the most documented recovery of its kind in the world, written about, studied, impossible to make go away. They had nothing left to threaten Caleb over, exactly as Robert had said. By giving everything away, he had made himself untouchable. A man with nothing left to take is a man no one can rob. The town found out, of course. There was no keeping a thing like that quiet, with federal vehicles up the lane for a week and the story breaking, eventually, in the national papers. A farmer in Crane County, Ohio, the headline said, had drained a marsh his family had been told for 70 years to leave alone, and found beneath it one of the largest intact caches of looted wartime assets ever recovered, and had turned every ounce of it over to the government for return to the families of its original owners. There were photographs of the farm, the marsh, the house his grandfather built. There were quotes from historians using words like miraculous and unprecedented. And there was, in the local paper, a small item that gave Caleb more grim satisfaction than he was proud of, an interview with one Dale Brunner, who was quoted as saying that he'd always known there was something special about that bottom ground, and that Henry Hartwell had been a fine man, and that the Hartwells were good people who deserved their good fortune. "You'll have nothing," Dale had said in the feed store. Caleb thought about that, reading the paper, and found he wasn't angry anymore. Dale was just a man who'd been wrong, the way the whole county had been wrong, the way they were all wrong about the men they pitted, sometimes, until the men they pitted did something. That made them look again. The looking again was a strange thing to live through. For 2 years Caleb had walked into the feed store and the diner and the grain elevator and felt the soft weight of the town's pity settle over him. The lowered voices, the careful kindness people show a man they've decided is finished. Now the weight was different, but no lighter. People who had shaken their heads over the Hartwell boy draining the devil's bathtub now wanted to shake his hand. The diner waitress who'd asked if everything was all right out at the farm now comped his coffee and told him she'd never doubted him, which they both knew was not true, and Caleb let it pass, because there was no profit in correcting it. Pete Cernick at the elevator, who'd told him his own father called that piece bad ground, now told the same story as though it had always been a story about hidden riches rather than a warning to keep the cattle clear. The town rewrote its memory of him in real time, the way towns do, and Caleb watched it happen and understood that he had become, overnight, a different kind of figure in the county's imagination. He had been the cautionary tale. Now he was the legend. Neither one had ever been the truth of him. The truth of him was just a man who'd run out of options and made a desperate bet, and then, when the bet paid off in a way no one could have dreamed, tried his best to do right by it. But towns don't have room for that kind of truth. They want the fall or the fairy tale, and Caleb had given them the fairy tale, and he let them have it, because it cost him nothing, and because somewhere underneath the new warmth there were people, a few, who were genuinely glad for him, and those few were worth the rest. Because here was the thing the town got wrong, even in their praise, even in their headlines. They thought Caleb had gotten rich. He had not. He had given it all away, every bar and every painting and every ledger, and he had wanted to, and he did not regret it for a single hour. But the law, as it turned out, did not let a man do a thing like that for nothing, even when nothing was what he asked for. There were statutes, Robert explained to him, sitting once more at the kitchen table, about the recovery of assets and the rights of finders, designed to encourage exactly what Caleb had done, to make it worth a person's while to come forward rather than melt the gold and stay quiet. Caleb had not come forward for a reward, but the reward existed whether he'd come for it or not, a finder's portion, a percentage, set by people far above Crane County, of the value of what he'd surrendered to be returned to its rightful owners. It was enough. That was all Caleb let himself understand about the number, at first, because the number itself was the kind of thing that had ruined his grandfather, and he did not intend to be ruined by it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It paid the bank in full and bought back the second tractor and would have bought 100 more, and it sat in an account that Robert helped him set up carefully, slowly, so that a man who had spent 2 years counting dollars at midnight would not lose his head. He paid the bank on a Tuesday. He drove into town and sat across the desk from the same loan officer who had sent him the thin white envelope. And he paid the foreclosure off in full, 91 days early, and he watched the man's face do something complicated. And he was polite about it, gracious even, because his mother had raised him to be, and because grinding a man's nose in his own wrong prediction was a small and ugly pleasure, and Caleb found, to his surprise, that he no longer had a taste for it. He had spent 2 years feeling small. He did not need to make anyone else feel that way to feel large. Then he drove the 2 counties over to his sister-in-law's house, where his wife and daughter had been living, and he stood on the porch with his heart going the way it had gone the first time he ever called Sarah, all those years ago, and he knocked on the door. It was Emma who opened it. She was taller than the last time he'd held her, the way children are always taller than the picture you carry of them. And she had a gap in her smile where the loose tooth had finally come out. And for a moment she just looked at him, this big sunburned man on her aunt's porch. And then her whole face changed, broke open into a thing so bright it hurt to look at. And she said, "Daddy." And she launched herself off the step and into his arms. And Caleb caught her and held her and felt her arms go around his neck. And he stood there on the porch and was, for the first time and longer than he could remember, simply and completely happy. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo her mother had always used on her. And she was talking already, fast, the way she did, telling him about the tooth and the dollar the tooth fairy had left, and the new school, and the girl named Priya. 11 months of a child's life pouring out of her all at once, because her daddy was finally there to pour it into. Caleb held her and listened and didn't try to say anything. Just let it wash over him. This small warm weight in his arms that was the only fortune he had ever truly been afraid of losing. He thought about all the Sunday phone calls, the long pauses, the "when are you coming to visit" that he'd never been able to answer. He thought about how close he'd come to losing this, not to Vance or to gold or to any of it, but to himself, to the man he'd let himself become, the one who'd loved a piece of dirt more loudly than he'd loved his own little girl. He pressed his face into her hair and made himself a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. Sarah came to the door behind her. She stood there, and she looked at him over Emma's head, and Caleb saw in her face that she had read the papers, that she knew that the whole impossible story had reached her. But that was not what was in her face. What was in her face was something older than the story, something from before the long defeat, and she didn't say anything about gold or marshes or the federal government. She just looked at him holding their daughter, and her eyes filled, and she said, very quietly, "You look better. You look like yourself again." "I am," Caleb said. "I'm myself again." He shifted Emma on his hip. "I came to ask if you'd both come home." He swallowed. "Not because of the money. The money doesn't. Sarah, I want to be clear. I'd be standing here asking the same thing if I'd come out of that marsh with nothing but mud on my boots. Because what I figured out down there in the dark wasn't about gold. It was that I'd been holding onto the wrong thing. I held onto the farm so hard I let go of you. And you were right. The farm doesn't love you back. But I do. I always did. I just got the order of things wrong, and it cost me you, and I have spent every day since wishing I could do it over." He looked at her, this woman he had married by the bottom ground a lifetime ago. "So that's what I'm asking. Come home. Let me get the order of things right this time." Sarah Hartwell looked at her husband on the porch with their daughter in his arms, and the tears spilled over, and she didn't say yes with words. She crossed the porch and put her arms around both of them, the 3 of them together in the cold spring sunlight, and that was the yes, and it was the only one Caleb had ever needed. They came home that weekend. The farm changed after that, but slowly, and not in the ways the town expected. People assumed Caleb would buy more land, buy new equipment, turn the modest Hartwell place into something grand. He didn't. He paid off the debt and he fixed what was broken, the barn roof, the fences, the second tractor, and he set the rest aside for Emma's future and for the lean years that always came. Because a man does not stop being a farmer just because he has had one impossible season. He planted his corn that spring, the same fields his father and grandfather had planted, and he worked them the same way, and he found that he loved the work again now that it was not the only thing standing between him and ruin. The fear was gone. That was the difference. He could love the land freely now, because it no longer held him by the throat. He did one thing that the town did not understand, and that he never bothered to explain. He took a portion of the finder's money, a real portion, and he set up a small fund in his grandfather's name, Henry Hartwell's name, that gave a little help each year to families in the county who were about to lose their farms the way Caleb had nearly lost his. A thin white envelope's worth of breathing room for the kind of people the bank sent thin white envelopes to. He didn't put his own name on it. He put his grandfather's. It was the closest thing he could think of to setting the old man's shame down for good, to turning the thing his grandfather had done out of fear and need into something that, at last, helped instead of hurt. His grandfather had taken money to save one family and bound them all in silence. Caleb gave money to save other families and asked nothing in return. It seemed to him, doing it, that this was how you finally finished a thing that had started 70 years ago in the dark. Not by burying it, by turning it inside out. The Marsh, when the federal people were finally finished with it, when the vault was emptied and the records boxed and the last SUV had rolled down the lane, Caleb let Phil back up. He did not plant it. He turned off no pump and laid no more pipe. He pulled out the corrugated drainage line and let the water come back the way it had always wanted to. And within a season the cattails returned, and the red-winged blackbirds, and the frogs in the evening, and the marsh became again what it had been before he ever touched it, a low green wet place at the bottom of the land. His grandfather had been right about one thing, in the end, even if for the wrong reasons. Some ground is meant to stay the way it is. Caleb had drained it once, for the right reasons, and he had taken from it the thing it had been hiding, and now he gave it back to itself. He put up no sign. He drew no line on any map. The rule was over. There was nothing left out there to leave alone. But he walked down to it, sometimes in the evenings. He would stand at the edge where he'd first seen the dark shape break the surface, and he would think about the things he'd learned in the cold buried room. About his grandfather, who had taken money he should not have taken to save the farm, and had spent his life ashamed, and had not been able to die without writing the truth down for someone to find. About the families across the world who had received letters beginning, "We have found something that belonged to your family," some of whom Reyes told him had written back, letters Caleb kept in a drawer and reread when the old smallness threatened to creep back in. Letters from people he would never meet thanking a farmer in Ohio for a grandmother's painting, a great-grandfather's name, a piece of a history they had thought was gone forever. One of the letters had a photograph in it. It was from a woman in her 70s, in a city Caleb had to find on a map, and the painting that had been returned to her was the one with the brass plate. The woman's pale face he had knelt in front of in the dark of the vault. The photograph showed the painting back on a wall, in a sunlit room, and below it stood the old woman and 3 generations of her family, children and grandchildren, all looking up at the face of an ancestor they had only ever known from one cracked black and white photo, restored to them now in color and oil and light after 80 years. On the back the old woman had written, in careful English that was not her first language, that the woman in the painting was her grandmother, who had not survived the war, and that her family had grieved the loss of the portrait almost as a second death, the last image of a face gone, and that now her great-grandchildren would grow up knowing that face. "Thank you," she had written, to the farmer who found her and gave her back. "We did not know your name, and now we will never forget it." Caleb kept that photograph in the drawer with the letters, and on the evenings when he stood at the marsh's edge he thought of that sunlit room half a world away, and the face on the wall, and he understood that he had not made himself rich. He had made those strangers a little less robbed. That was the thing he was proudest of, in the end, and it was the thing the town never quite understood, because the town measured a man by what he kept, and Caleb had finally learned to measure himself by what he gave back. A year after the night of the fire, on a warm evening in spring, Caleb stood at the edge of the refilled marsh with Emma on his shoulders and Sarah beside him, watching the blackbirds wheel over the cattails as the sun went down behind the ridge. Emma asked him, the way children do, to tell the story again. The one about the buried treasure, and Caleb told it the way he always told it to her. The version Sarah had said was the only one she'd accept. About a daddy who drained a marsh nobody thought he should, and found something nobody believed was there, and gave it back to the people it belonged to, and didn't get a scratch, and got his family back, and lived right here, on this land, by this water, where he'd always belonged. Emma had heard it 100 times. She still made him tell it. And when he got to the end, the part where the daddy gives the treasure away, she asked him, as she always did, the question Caleb thought was the wisest question anyone had asked him through the whole strange business. But Daddy, why didn't you keep it? And Caleb, standing at the edge of the water where his whole life had turned, gave her the answer he had found in the dark of the buried room. The answer his grandfather had never managed to reach. The answer that had cost 3 generations of Hartwells to learn. Because some things, baby, he said, aren't yours to keep. They're just yours to find, and then to hand to the people who need them more than you do. And the keeping of them never made anybody happy. But the giving did. The giving made all the difference in the world. He lifted her down off his shoulders, and he took Sarah's hand, and the 3 of them walked back up the slope toward the house his grandfather had built, the windows gold with evening light, and behind them the marsh settled into dusk, dark and wet, and holding nothing now but frog song, and the last red light on the water, free at last of its terrible secret, free to be only what it had always been meant to be. The richest thing Caleb Hartwell ever found at the bottom of that marsh was not the gold, and it was not the paintings, and it was not the number in the account that bought back his farm. It was the discovery, made down there in the cold and the dark with everything on the line, of who he was when no one was watching and everything was at stake. A man could spend his whole life chasing what he could keep and die poor in every way that counted. Or he could find, the way Caleb found, that the only fortune that ever truly changes a life is the one you give away to make someone else's life whole. His grandfather had buried a secret to protect his family, and it had nearly destroyed them. Caleb had dragged that secret into the light to free his family, and it had given him back everything that mattered. The marsh kept the water. Caleb kept his family. And somewhere across the world, in homes he would never see, the faces in the paintings hung again on the walls where they belonged, looking out at the grandchildren of the people who had loved them, home at last after the long dark years under the mud. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.